Welcome to Lesson 5.5, Implementing Access and Authorization Criteria. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Identity and Access Management domain, and we are in Key Area of Knowledge D, which is Implement and Manage Authorization Mechanisms. Our topics are going to include rights and permissions, privilege, need to know and least privilege, authorization approaches, authorization creep, dual control, and separation of duties. So in this lesson, we're going to be covering some fundamental access and authorization concepts, which are going to include talking about rights, permissions, privilege, need to know and least privilege, default, deny, and allow as authorization approaches, authorization creep, dual control, and separation of duties. But I do want to give you a terminology warning that access-related terms, the ones we just looked at, are often used sort of interchangeably and incorrectly, and their meaning may vary by vendor, by operating system, and by application. So it's really important inside your organization that you adopt a standard vocabulary when you're creating policy, standards, and procedures. So particularly when we start talking about rights and permissions and privilege, that you come up with a standard meaning, that you publish that meaning, and that standard vocabulary is what you use throughout all of your governance documents. So let's start going through them. The first are rights. Rights are generally referred to the ability of a subject to take an action. For example, the right to log on remotely, the right to install software, the right to create user accounts. Now, rights can be assigned to user accounts, to group accounts, or to profiles, really depending upon the system or the device. In the Microsoft Windows environment, local security policies and group policies are used to assign rights. Permissions are functions that a subject can perform on an object, a file, or a folder. For example, the permission to read a file, the permission to write to, or to modify, or delete. So rights are an action a subject can take. Permissions are function that a subject can perform on an object. Access control lists are generally used to assign permissions, but not always. And permissions can be assigned to user accounts, to group accounts, or profiles, depending upon the system or device. Permissions are generally cumulative, meaning that a subject can be assigned a permission explicitly. A subject can also be a member of a group that has been assigned permission, and they're going to get both sets. They'll get the permissions assigned to their user account, and they'll get the permissions assigned to their group account, so they'll be cumulative. Permissions can also be explicit or inherited. So permissions can be granted explicitly at an object level, or they can flow down to other objects. We see that most often in a folder structure, where permissions may be granted to a subject at an upper level folder. Then those permissions will flow down to all the files in that folder, but also to any subfolders. So permissions can be cumulative, permissions can be explicit, permissions can be inherited. Now exactly how that's going to work really depends upon the operating system or the application. So you need to become familiar with your operating systems and your applications to truly get an understanding of how permissions will work in your environment. The concept of privilege relates to overriding capabilities. We find privilege in superuser accounts, root accounts, administrative accounts. These are accounts that don't need to have explicit rights or permissions granted, because inherent in the role are all of those rights and permissions. So it's often said that privilege trumps rights or permissions. They don't have to have those explicitly assigned. It's really embedded already in their role. Privilege credential theft and privilege escalation are two of our most serious attacks. Privilege credential theft is when the attacker wants to capture the credentials of an administrative, a root, or a super user account. Doing so would really give them access to absolutely everything. Privilege escalation is when an attacker will start with a lower level account and over time be able to escalate those privileges by sort of watching what happens on the network and eventually perhaps capturing privileged credentials. Pass the hash attack is a technique in which an attacker will capture hashed account credentials on one computer and then reuse those credentials to authenticate to another. Now, generally, a pass-the-hash attack is going to be going after privileged credentials because those are the ones that certainly have the most value in an organization. Determining who to grant rights, permissions, and privileges to should always be based upon the principles of need to know and least privilege. Need to know means that the subject has a demonstrated and approved reason for being granted access. Let me repeat that. Need to know means the subject has a demonstrated and approved reason for granting access. Once need to know has been established, then the principle of least privilege should be enforced. Least privilege means assigning subjects only the rights and permissions needed to complete their assigned task. So need to know so that the subject has a demonstrated and approved reason for being granted access, and then least privilege so that the subject should only be assigned the rights and permissions needed to complete their assigned tasks. Need to know and least privilege always go hand in hand. Authorization is the process of assigning authenticated subjects rights and permissions, and there are two approaches that can be taken. The first approach is default allow, which means that any access or action not explicitly forbidden is allowed. It means that you have to create a list of saying, here are all the things that you cannot do, because otherwise everything is fair game. The second approach, and the one that is commonly adopted in a secure environment, is default deny. Default deny means any access or action not explicitly allowed is forbidden. So you have to have access controls that say, I'm going to allow you to do something, and if I haven't explicitly allowed the subject to do something, then it will be denied. Authorization creep is the accumulation of access rights, permissions, and privileges over time. And this often happens with employees who change roles, who perhaps are covering other roles, or have a long tenure. And so over time, as they've moved around, they've been given additional rights, additional privileges, or additional permissions. One of the reasons that we audit on a regular basis is to ensure that the rights and privileges and permissions that are assigned to any subject are appropriate for their role at that time. And the last two topics we want to cover are dual control and separation of duties. Dual control is the practice of having more than one subject or key required to complete a specific task. Now, an example might be that we want to open a bank vault, but we're not going to allow just one person to unilaterally open that vault. We need two people, each with their own key or code, that both have to come to the vault, both have to agree to open it, and have to use their specific key or code. So again, dual control, the practice of having more than one subject or key required to complete a specific task. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a requester and an approver. Separation of duties is the breaking down of a process into tasks that are assigned to different subjects so that no one subject is in complete control of a process. So different than dual control, we don't need two people to do the same task, but what we're doing is we are separating processes down into discrete tasks that are assigned to different subjects, again, so no one subject is in complete control of the process. So let's review the concepts we just discussed. We started with rights and permissions. Rights are an action that a subject can take. Permissions are what a subject can do to an object, like read or write, create, delete. We looked at privilege and how that's assigned to a super user, an administrative user, or root, and how privilege trumps rights and permissions. We looked at the very fundamental concepts of need to know and least privilege. We looked at authorization approaches of default allow and default deny. We discussed authorization creep that can happen over time and the importance of doing user account reviews or audits to ensure that no one subject has too many rights or permissions. And we looked at dual control and separation of duties. The terms in the right-hand column that you need to know are rights, permission, privilege, need to know, least privilege, default deny, segregation of duties, and dual control. So put me on pause, take a few minutes, match these up, come on back and we'll go through them together. All right, let's review Lesson 5.5 terms. Rights are the ability of a subject to take an action. Permissions are actions related to an object, so they're actions taken by a subject related to an object, such as read, write, delete, create, modify. Privilege is overriding capabilities. Those are privileges that are generally assigned to accounts like root or superuser or administrator, and we said that privilege trumps rights and permission. Need to know is that fundamental concept that says a subject must have a demonstrated reason for access. Least privilege is the concept that no more permissions than needed should ever be assigned to a subject, even when they have a need to know. Default deny is the authorization approach that says anything not explicitly allowed is denied. Segregation of duty is when we break a process down into discrete tasks and assign those tasks to different subjects so that no one entity is in complete control of a process. Dual control is when we need two entities to complete a specific task. So we're going to end this lesson like we do all of them with our CISSP exam tips. You want to remember that privilege trumps rights and permissions. When in doubt, deny access. Authorization creep is the accumulation of access rights, permissions, and privileges over time. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.